several more special functional areas in the cerebral cortex, but I just kind of picked out some that I wanted you to know. You don't have to worry about any others. You don't have to worry about identifying where they're at. Just the information about each one that I listed there. So once again, that is the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex, remember, is just a very thin shell on the very outside of the cerebrum. It's not very much. It's only 2 to 4 millimeters thick. That leaves a lot still to talk about with the cerebrum. Beneath that cerebral cortex, beneath that gray matter, lies the interior of the cerebrum, which is composed mostly up of white matter. And just like the white matter of our spinal cord, we're talking about myelinated axons that carry signals up and down, but also from front to back, and can actually crisscross from one side of the brain to the other. So we group the tracks in the cerebrum into three types: projection, commissural, and association. Got a couple illustrations on the right to show them off. Projection tracks are just like the ones in the spinal cord, and that they extend vertically between higher and lower brain and spinal cord centers. In other words, they carry signals up and down. They carry information between the cerebrum and lower parts of the CNS, things like the thalamus, the brainstem, and the spinal cord, or from lower parts of the CNS up to the cerebrum. They're shown here in green. Actually, we can see they're going to crisscross right here in the pyramids of the medulla. There's that decussation that we talked about earlier. And so they just carry signals up and down. Commissural, which I love that they start with the letter C, they cross, which, I say C there because, C for commissural, C for cross. They're the ones that connect the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. On top of that, they also form what's called the corpus callosum, which is, kind of turn the page sideways, looks like the letter C, and both the words corpus and callosum start with the letter C. That's a structure that connects the two cerebral hemispheres and allows them to communicate with one another. You can see the corpus callosum is labeled right here. When lobotomies were a standard practice in medicine, which they are not anymore. If you don't know what a lobotomy is, basically they shove the probe up to the nasal cavity, and they would a lot of times end up severing the corpus callosum and cutting off that connection between the two sides of the brain. And doing so, that could obviously be very, very detrimental to the individual's health. Obviously not morally something that is appropriate, so it's not done anymore, at least this part of the world. I don't know about other countries. All right, and then association tracks, are these ones here on the top in our sagittal section. What they do is they connect gyri with one another, so they basically allow signals to go back from the front to the back, or from back to the front. So they just stay on the same hemisphere and carry signals front to back to front. Okay, so that was white matter. We're going to jump back into talking about gray matter and what we call the basal nuclei or basal ganglia, which is kind of the older traditional term. If I were to go back a couple of slides, I had them listed as basal ganglia. But basal nuclei kind of is a little bit better description of them, and that's why they've changed it that way. But there are three masses of gray matter found deep within the cerebral hemisphere. These include the globus pallidus, the putamen, and the caudate nucleus. Hopefully I pronounced those correctly. The globus pallidus and the putamen are two basal nuclei, are lateral to the thalamus. Together they are known as the lentiform nucleus. Caudate nucleus is a large head connected to a smaller tail by a long comma-shaped body. Together, the lentiform and caudate nuclei are called were known as the corpus striatum. A lot of information that you really don't need to worry about. What you definitely want to know are these last two bullets, which tell you exactly what the basal nuclei do, which is what's important in this class since this is physiology. Major function of our basal nuclei is to help regulating initiation and then the termination of the movement. So starting and stopping. Start writing when you stop writing. When you start running, when you stop running. The globus pallidus helps regulate muscle tone. Also helps regulate. It's not the only thing, as we learned earlier, required for specific body movements. The basal nuclei also control subconscious contractions of skeletal muscles. So subconsciously, not like, full on mental control. Like, subconsciously when we contract our diaphragm to allow us to breathe, which we don't really think about until we want to actually stop breathing, which you might be, thinking about breathing and doing that right now as I talk. But most of the time, we're just subconsciously contracting our diaphragm and breathing without really even paying attention. Our basal nuclei also help initiate and terminate some cognitive processes, and this includes things like attention, memory, and planning. And they also may act with the limbic system to regulate emotional behaviors. Now, speaking of the limbic system, our limbic system is the next part of our brain I want to talk about, and kind of describe this as our primitive brain. Okay, it's a ring of structures on the inner border of the cerebrum and the floor of the diencephalon. It circles around the upper part of the brainstem and the corpus callosum. It includes several things. Okay, some of these we've already kind of mentioned. Some of them are more brand new. Structures include the cingulate gyrus, which is above the corpus callosum. Function of the cingulate gyrus is to regulate emotions and pain. It is involved with predicting and avoiding negative consequences. A good example of that would be, studying for an exam so you don't fail. Okay, that would be a negative consequence. Okay, your hippocampus, I've mentioned before, is a portion of the parahippocampal gyrus, extends into the floor lateral ventricle. A lot more anatomy-based stuff. What you want to know is that it is involved with memory. Okay, we talked about it a couple different points. Back on our slide on the hypothalamus, we mentioned the hippocampus is involved with memory. Okay, so hopefully when you learn stuff, you're keeping it in your hippocampus and not just cramming it in and then forgetting about it, because that's not what I want. I want you to learn. Okay? Dentate gyrus lies between the hippocampus and the parahippocampal gyrus. I won't really get into any more detail than that. It's really more anatomy, but that's okay. Your amygdala is a group of several neurons located close to the tail of the caudate nucleus. It's involved with fear, so being afraid and discriminating objects necessary for human survival. Kind of another example of why I call this like our primitive brain. Okay, we're not worried about like gathering spears and that kind of stuff because we're a pretty advanced society. But once upon a time, thinking back hundreds of years ago, those types of things were more important. Okay, the mammillary bodies, they're parts of the hypothalamus located near the midline and are near the what we call peduncles. But these are relay stations for reflexes related to the sense of smell. There are two nuclei of the thalamus, anterior and medial nucleus, that are part of the limbic system. Your olfactory bulbs, which are the flattened bodies of the olfactory pathway. As I've mentioned, olfaction is fanciful for the sense of smell. And then the final structures include the fornix, striae terminalis, striae medullaris, medial forebrain bundle, and mammillothalamic tract, which are linked by bundles of interconnecting myelin axons. A lot of information there, really more anatomy-based stuff. But anywhere what I kind of told you, like the hippocampus, I told you what it does. That's stuff you want to focus on. Okay. So, I nickname it the primitive brain, but it has a better nickname, and that it's what we call our emotional brain. Okay. It governs emotional aspects of behavior, things like pleasure, pain, docility, affection, fear, and anger. Okay. Stuff that, if you think about like comparing us to other animals, like a dog, which I talk about my two dogs, and their emotional brain is, kind of in charge. Okay, they're trying to satisfy their emotions. They think emotionally. They think about, getting belly rubs and getting treats and going for walks and super simple stuff. They're not planning for the future. They're not composing music. They're not reading. They're not writing. They're not using their cerebral cortex like we are. They're using their limbic system. That's why, aside from calling it the emotional brain, I like to think of it as like the primitive brain. Okay. Aside from emotions, your limbic system is also involved with smell or olfaction, and that involves those olfactory bulbs, and memory, since that involves the hippocampus. Okay, if you've ever heard the phrase right-brained or left-brained, when somebody talks about like their personality. So we kind of talk personality a little bit here today. Um, that is a concept called hemispheric lateralization. Okay. Although our brain is almost symmetrical on its right and left sides, there are subtle anatomical and physiological differences between the two hemispheres that exist. Okay. Although they share performance of many functions, each hemisphere also specializes in performing certain unique functions. We call this property hemispheric lateralization. Okay. So in other words, your right hemisphere controls certain things, your left hemisphere controls certain things. Okay. And a breakdown on those specific functional differences between the right and left hemispheres is provided here in table 14.3. And it is something that I actually do want you to know for the exam. So what I mean is I expect you to know, for example, that the right hemisphere is involved with being musically and artistic aware, having perception of space and patterns, okay, identifying and discriminating against or among odors, okay, being able to tell when something smells sweet versus when something smells, awful, okay, understanding spoken and written language is a left hemisphere function. Reasoning, understanding and having skills in science and math, that's a left hemisphere function. And now there's a lot of studies that are actually kind of finding out that some of these things might not be as cut and dry left and right. Okay, but since the textbook still teaches it this way, I'm going to still teach it this way until that ends. If it ever is proven to be false, and I will continue to teach it this way. So I do expect you guys to know these things, contest it. And I'm not going to read through them all. You can kind of do that on your own. Okay, what we'll do now, almost here at the end, is talk about integration, something we've discussed all the way going back to our very first lecture, okay, where we said that integration was working together as a team and in order to maintain and achieve homeostasis. Well, when we talk about integration in the cerebrum, it's the processing of sensory information by analyzing and storing it and making decisions for various responses. Okay. The integrated functions of our cerebrum include wakefulness and sleep, language, emotions, motivation, and learning and memory. A lot of this stuff gets discussed, like I said, in psychology class, where you learn a lot about what your brain does and a lot about these different things. Okay, just to give you a real basic description on each of those different things, I want to do that now. Beginning with sleep, which we've talked earlier in this lecture about, a state of unconsciousness from which an individual can be aroused by stimuli. A typical adult spends about 8 hours a day sleeping. A lot of students probably spend less than that. Some spend a lot more than that. Overall, 8 hours is what they say is on average. It means sleep consumes about a third of our lives. So a very significant amount of our life is spent asleep. Okay. Normally, sleep consists of two phases. We have what we call NREM and REM, which are short for non-rapid eye movement and rapid eye movement. Okay. Basically, if you're kind of blinking, you're going through rapid eye movement or REM sleep. If your eyes are kind of staying still, you're in NREM. Now, each of those involves different parts to it. Like I think there's like 4 or 5 different stages of NREM. REM sleep is actually, even though it looks like we're kind of waking up with those eye movements, is the deeper of the two. That would be like when you do your dreaming. There's a lot that goes on with sleep. If you just kind of think about sleep, it's just like powering down and getting energy back. So like plugging in a phone, it's kind of what we do. And it's kind of crazy. If you want to learn more about sleep, take psychology or read a little bit more in your textbook than what I've provided for you here. And let's talk language. Humans use language to communicate with one another. Language can be described as a system of vocal sounds and symbols that conveys information. Most commonly, we talk about language as being spoken and or written. Okay. Emotions are subjective feelings that you have about your own sense of well-being when a particular situation arises. They're usually accompanied by a variety of physical responses. And these are, autonomic responses. Like when you're emotionally affected, your body is affected as well. It's not just your brain but also things like your heart rate, your blood pressure, your breathing rate, your digestion can be affected. Okay. We also have somatic motor responses like smiling and frowning, running, jumping, or any other type of movement involving skeletal muscle contraction. Thinking about different types of emotions when we're happy, when we're sad. We cry, we frown, we get red face. I mean, blood pressure goes up, it goes down. We do all sorts of different things where it's an emotional, mental thing that affects our physical as well. And motivation is a internal process, or is the internal processes that direct an individual's behavior toward a particular goal. Many motivated behaviors start with a need, which is anything that an individual deems necessary to have. And learning is the ability to acquire new information or skills through instruction or experience. The main goal I have for you students as your teacher is for you to learn. The fact that you are, here in class or listening at home and watching this shows that you're exhibiting motivation. Okay, so that's a good step towards it. Okay. Learning is, acquiring that information or those skills by being instructed or through experience. There are two main categories of learning: associative and non-associative. Associative learning occurs when a connection is made between two stimuli, whereas non-associative learning occurs when repeated exposure to a single stimulus causes a change in behavior. And like I said, you'll learn a lot about this stuff if you take psychology. So I'm just kind of briefly touching on these things. And the memory is the process by which information acquired through learning is stored and then hopefully can be retrieved and, proven on a test by, putting down the correct answers. All right, the very last thing I want to talk about are the cranial nerves, which we've discussed a little bit about at various points in this lecture. Cranial nerves are nerves of the peripheral nervous system originating from or terminating in the brain. So either they start in the brain or terminate in the brain. We have 12 pairs of them, so 24 total, and they're numbered from anterior to posterior as they attach to the brain. Okay. Cranial nerve pair number 1 are at the very front of the brain. Those are the olfactory nerves that you can see labeled there, all the way to the back, what we call the hypoglossal nerves. Okay. Illustrated here is a picture of the brain upside down. So we can see the bottom of it, and all of the cranial nerves are highlighted yellow or that kind of goldish shade so that you can see them nicely. You can see we have one on each side of the brain, so they're all in pairs. They are classified as one of 3 types: sensory, motor, and mixed. Okay, sensory nerves, hopefully this is pretty common sense, are going to only contain or predominantly contain sensory neurons. Okay, so in other words, they're going to contain neurons that are carrying signals into the brain. Okay, that includes that pair there at the front, the olfactory cranial nerves, but also your optic nerves. Those actually connect to the back of your eyeballs, and then connected into our inner ear are the vestibular cochlear nerves, cranial nerves number 7. Okay, so that should say 8. There should be another Roman numeral right there, number 1, and cranial nerve number 8, not number 7. Okay. Your motor nerves are the opposite of sensory nerves in that they contain or predominantly contain motor neurons. So their signals are going away from the brain. Okay. They include the oculomotor nerves. Those are ones that help move the eyes around, so allow you to move up and down and roll your eyes like my wife loves to do to me. Cranial nerves number 4, trochlear, abducens, accessory, and hypoglossal. That is the actual. Sorry, I was getting ready to say something I should have. Okay, hypoglossal attached to our tongue. Okay. And then if they have a mixture of both sensory and motor neurons, we call them mixed nerves. And pretty hopefully straightforward what we call mixed nerves. So they're like a 2-lane highway. They got signals going in 2 different directions. You've got the trigeminal pair, the facial pair, the glossopharyngeal pair, and the vagus pair. And now some of these we cover quite a bit. Some of them I'll just kind of mention a little bit about. For example, these first 3 sensory nerves there, we're going to talk more about those in our next unit, because that's when we're going to talk about sensations. In our next lecture, we're going to talk a lot about the vagus nerves. Now, notice the word Vegas is spelled not like Las Vegas, V-E-G-A-S, it's V-A-G-U-S, which actually means wandering. Okay? It looks like, if I go back to this previous page, that these nerves are really short. Okay? Some of them are. Okay? But for in case of things like the vagus nerves, that's a pair of nerves that actually travel down from the brain all the way down into our belly. Okay? So what you're seeing here is just like the root or the like the base, or like think of them like a tree that's been chopped down. All you're seeing is the stump. Okay. Here on our final slide is table 8.1 that summarizes each of those pair, gives you their number, gives you their special name, tells you whether they're sensory mixed or motor, and then a brief description of what they do. Okay. Some of them pretty easy: olfactory, sense of smell; optic, visual input, so that sense of sight. Okay. Vagus nerves, I mentioned, we talk a lot more about. They're the major regulators, or I shouldn't say major regulators, but they're the major nerves that carry signals as part of our parasympathetic nervous system for that rest and digest response. So they're going to be involved with stuff that we're going to talk about in our next lecture. Okay. Like I said, we don't talk about all of them in great detail. We really don't talk too much about like the accessory or the hypoglossal nerves, but we do talk about a few of them in a lot more detail. I do expect you to be able to know this table though, so make sure you can identify what the nerve does, whether it's sensory, whether it's motor. I don't really care about matching up number and name. Definitely know the names more so than the numbers. So, okay, and with that said, call it quits there. Thanks.